So here's our tools and techniques. Notice how the charter output from the past project becomes an input here. From the past process becomes an input here. We need to business case and a benefits management plan, because whoever is going to be getting these benefits, this might be for the employees of the company, right? So we need to think about them as stakeholders too. So we take the business case, the benefits management plan, the project management plan. We haven't gotten to planning yet, but here we are taking a communications management plan and a stakeholder engagement plan. This is the first example of the fact that we as PMs jump back and forth in process groups. So this shows a clear example of how, we may be in initiating, but then we'll go to planning, and we might create the communications management plan and the stakeholder engagement plan already. It might have already been a template, right? Many of you might work at places with PMOs, and this stuff is a template. And so we don't make individual management plans, and you're going to see that in a second. So, but just another example of how we jump back and forth between process groups. Any other documents, contracts, or other agreements, they're going to be key stakeholders. EFs, no PAs, you're going to use our expert judgment. We'll gather data. We'll analyze it. We'll represent it, meaning we'll make some chart or diagram. We'll have meetings to discuss it. And in the output, we'll have some register that, accurately reflects all the folks, who may be impacted by the project. We may request change based on who we find in that project. We may update our project plan on that, and we may update our documents. Because remember, we might do this process, we could be a week away from closing the project, and we identify another key stakeholder to get sign off, maybe some regulatory agency, et cetera. And now we have to go back and do this process. All right, so that's where we may get updates to our project documents and our project management plan, because again, it's iterative. We jump back and forth.
No, it's CJ, I'd like to add something to that. So probably seeing that conceptually, realizing that it's a cyclic type of approach, like you were saying, things go jumping back and forth. For me, that has been the hardest thing to visually visually see it and to understand it. Because if you just look at, when you see all this stuff in PMBOK and everything that you see, it looks so sequential, but it's not. I assure everybody that it's not. And the fact that you'll be taking phase gate close, and you'll be using that when you have designs, when you're closing out, final validating the designs. Again, using all those process groups in each phase, in each life cycle phase of the project. Understanding that is, to me, that's like the golden key. And it's taken me a long time to realize that happens. And that test is, it really, the basis of that test is understanding that concept, that this stuff is jumping back and forth.
Yeah, we are. We definitely are. But and so I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the idea of the register, this living, breathing document. And so literally, I like to call it the Excel spreadsheet, right? Because we may start out with just a name and a title and, and their function, their influence, their expectations, but this may grow to their level of power, right? And are they a positive or a negative? Are they for or against the project? All right, so this may grow, and you just don't know how it's going to grow, but this is the idea.
Hey, CJ, I have a question here, and this is more from my own project experiences. I completely agree that the stakeholders can be identified later, but I've had a couple projects where stakeholders that are coming at the end is actually encroaching the scope of the project and trying to change the scope of the project. So I'm wondering if there's any suggestions on how to best manage that. So I'll give you an example. The hospital full-scale exercise that I worked on this 2 years ago, and then we're probably going to get the project again this year. The regulation, so the environmental factors change, so there are more healthcare facilities that are required to do this type of drill. So at the end, a lot of potential stakeholders came in at the end wanting to join the overall project drill. And so it's trying to moderate kind of which stakeholders, is it possible to integrate them at the end? Like, is that changing the scope of the project too much? Because the project started initially as just 15 hospitals, and then they're suddenly wanting to add, 15 hospitals, 5 health departments, and they wanted to add like 17 ambulatory surgical centers.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'm going to you know, a lot of the questions that you all may have on this call, there's going to be two answers. Sometimes they'll be the same, but there's going to be the practical application, and then there's going to be the answer for the exam, right? So I always make sure I give two because I want to make sure you pass, right? So I'll give you the practical application in my experience, and you know, this is just mine. Take it how you may. Is what I learned this again more from doing more agile projects. Is transparency is king. So as new stakeholders come on, then we say, hey, we've got new stakeholders and we've joined. And so we just promote that. We let people know we've got these folks coming on. We've collected their requirements and we've added them into the list, right? Now that we've got the list, if we were to do all of this, this is what the scope looks like. Are you guys sure you still want to do that? You know, you kind of go through and you put it back on the group, and then almost it seemed like, hey, you guys just can't come in and start changing our thing, and then you don't have to do it. The group does it for you. Or the group is like, hey, no, wait, this is a great idea. Let's increase this. And, you know, then now you have a longer engagement. I mean, you know, so it's sort of a win-win. That's my, you know, take that as you may. Now for the exam, this is the idea is that new stakeholder comes on, you always update the register, and then you go and immediately collect their requirements. And it doesn't mean that you're going to meet their requirements, because you would have to go through a formal change control procedure. And then, you know, and then that's where the scope would grow. But for the exam, nope, you identify them and then you collect their requirements. Always. Okay. And they're going to say something like, you're a project manager for XYZ project, and your project is about 80% complete. The company has hired a new executive and your project will impact them, you know, tremendously. You should, and it'll say A, collect their requirements. B, inform them of your project. C, add them to the weekly status report. D, do nothing. Your project is almost finished. What are you guys going to do?
A.
You're going to collect the requirements. You're going to collect the requirements. You're going to take the most action, right? So, you know, you're never going to do nothing. Just know that's always going to be incorrect for PMI, except for change. Our number one goal is to prevent change. We'll get to that. That's the one thing we don't want to do, right? We want to prevent change. But other than that, you're always going to take the most action in these types of questions. So I'm spending a lot of time here because I won't later on, because I know that especially these two processes, you're already grasping these concepts, and they're gonna hold true as we continue. All right, so as we deep dive, now we're going to deep dive into each of the inputs, right? So we talked about the ITTOs. Here's the output, what it looks like. Now let's get into each of the inputs, then tools and techniques and outputs. So charter and business case, give you that initial stakeholder list, right? Because, you know, as you guys mentioned, you may have 7 or 8 key stakeholders that actually sign the charter. So that's your initial stakeholder list. And then additional inputs help evolve and improve the stakeholder list. So this goes back to the idea that we are jumping back and forth, because as you plan, you know, it adds in. But initially, the business case is going to give you that list, and you start there. And then you further identify folks as you iterate in your processes, even the first time you do them. And then the change log or the issue log may introduce new folks too. And that makes sense. You may change a vendor or a supplier. And then, simply, and a lot of times we change a vendor, but we won't update our stakeholder register. We might even have that. It's like, okay, well, I got their contact info. They're already in now that they sent me an email, it's in my information, right? We don't need to do that. Well, for PMI, or if you were building a rocket ship, yes, then you would do it, right? So, this goes back to the tailoring considerations. And let me just mention again, obviously agreements, contracts, and then your plans. As we're gathering information and we're building this list of stakeholders so that we can analyze them, well, then we're going to gather it. And this is pretty straightforward. Questionnaires and surveys. The ways that we typically uncover is we just ask and find out, well, who else? Do you know anybody? Is there anybody else we should take into account? But all the different ways that you may do that up front in sort of a formal manner, maybe a focus group or interviewing people, mass information collection techniques. You may send out a survey, a questionnaire, a form for people to fill up. By the way, you should always do that. Get people to, do the documentation for you, because it just saves you time. Or brainstorm. Who do we think? And this is really brainstorming for data gathering. Think more of the EEFs. Think more of the legal folks and the regulatory folks and the folks who they're not they don't have a financial or, from a resource perspective, they don't have a stake in the project, but they may be impacted. So that's where we have to more do the brainstorming to find those whale-watching groups that I was mentioning earlier. And then you analyze them. Use your expert judgment. Again, different types of SMEs, what their level of interest is. And sometimes you don't just ask them, you kind of have conversations, you might have to be strategic about it and kind of draw the information out. And then other people, you just do it straightforward, and you may even sit down with a team and you may have the list of all these people, and then you go through and do a very formal process and do this. And it will look something like this. So you have a stakeholder register. And so we chart power over interest, right? And so the people who, in sort of this, in this upper right-hand corner of the box, who have the most power and they're most interested, we've got to manage those people closely, right? Those are the people that, they want to know a lot. And, they think of these as like your customers, right? The end of the client, the sponsor, right? You may have a person or a group of stakeholders there. And then you got people who have a high level of power, but they're not that interested. And so then they fit on that sort of top left corner box. And think of that as like maybe the executives internally within your company. So if you're doing a project for a customer, the customer is going to be, we manage them closely. But then those folks who have a high level of power, but they're not that interested, because within our company, we've got 50 projects going on. So we just got to keep our execs satisfied. All right. So that's what we do with those folks. Right. The folks who, they don't have much power, but they're very interested in the project and they want to know any and everything. Well, we got to keep them informed. And so that's what we do there. And then those folks who don't have much power and they don't have much interest, we monitor them, right? We don't do nothing. Remember from PMI, we'll never just do nothing. We'll put them on a watch list. We'll just monitor what their activities are. So your questions on the exam from identifying stakeholders, many of them will come from this graph. And they'll say, those stakeholders who have a high level of power and high level of interest, what do we do with them? Or they'll describe the fact that a stakeholder, has a high level of power, but they're not that interested. They won't just come out and explicitly use those words. They'll describe it and then say, what would you do with this type of stakeholder? And then you got to choose between the A, B, C, or D. Keep satisfied, manage closely, monitor, keep informed. So that's this is the power and interest and power and influence grid. They're both used the same way. There's a Salience model, and it's a Venn diagram. We don't have it here, but imagine 3 circles, and you would have power, urgency, and legitimacy. So you would have those folks who have power, a sense of urgency, yes, and a sense of legitimacy. And then the person who fits in all 3 would be your definitive stakeholder. The person who has a lot of power and they want it now, they'd be your dangerous stakeholders. The people who have no power, but they have a sense of urgency and legitimately they're affected, they're sort of a dependent stakeholder. They need you. So that's another way that you can identify and then analyze stakeholders, is use the Salience model. This one's is best used if you're doing a lot of change management work. The Salience model comes in good, because in those types of projects, everybody is highly interested and has some sort of power. So the Salience model works a little better.